Dear colleagues, subtitled as an overview, my lecture necessarily covers a wide array of texts and issues. In the following, I would like to address a small number of these issues that seem crucial for a proper understanding of the subsequent overview. Point A, politics. The title of my lecture contains a far-reaching implication. It assumes that there is such a thing as political thought in the Hebrew Bible, an assumption to which not everybody would consent, and what is more, it assumes that political thought is not restricted to one or more books of the Hebrew Bible, but rather can be found in almost all of them. In their recent book, The Beginnings of Politics, Moshe Halbertal and Stephen Holmes claim that politics in the Hebrew Bible only begins in the book of Samuel, because in the book of Samuel and in the book of Kings, the king is at issue, the real king, the earthly king, not the divine king as in the books prior to the book of Samuel. Similarly, Michael Walzer doubts that the Hebrew Bible contains much of what we nowadays call politics. Quote, "How much room for politics can there be when God is the ultimate ruler?" Quote end. On the other hand, many biblical scholars would acknowledge that the books of the prophets have a political message. Okay, the social criticism, but also the cultic criticism are obviously political issues. But how far does that go? Regularly, scholars suggest that the prophets were no political reformers. They were not part of the political active circles. This may be true for the historical figures of Amos, Hosea, and Micah, but what about Jeremiah and Ezekiel? And what about the prophetical books that were compiled in their names? It is suffice here to mention Ezekiel 40 to 48, the so-called draft constitution. As for the Pentateuch, many would take the office laws in Deuteronomy 16 to 20 into consideration. American scholar Dean McBride called it the polity of the covenant people and, quote, the American Constitution's most ancient antecedent, end of quote. On the other hand, German scholar Lothar Perlit argued that Deuteronomy does not aim at the reform of a state, but at the reform of a religious community. The latter opinion does not seem appropriate to me, because a religious community does not need a law on roof parapets, as in Deuteronomy 22, or a law on the appointment of military leaders, as in Deuteronomy 20. The Pentateuch and the prophets thematized the standards of a civil society, not the morals of a sect. The term political has a broad meaning. In the following, I do not cover the realm of foreign affairs, of negotiations and treaties. I restrict myself to those texts which have the constitution, the organization and the administration of the Israelite or Judahite or Judean community as their subject. Next issue, theocracy. Dean McBride adverts to the fact that ancient Jewish historian Josephus used the term politeia to characterize the Pentateuch. Quote, and there is no reason to doubt that he understood politeia to represent Hebrew Torah in its characteristically Deuteronomic usage, end of quote. On the other hand, Josephus introduced the term theocracy to describe the peculiarity of the Jewish polity. And for many authors, theocracy and politics are mutually exclusive. Wellhausen, the forefather of this line of thought, wrote in his famous chapter Die Theokratie als Idee und als Anstalt, quote, die mosaische Theokratie, das Residuum eines untergegangenen Staates, ist selbst kein Staat, sondern ein unter ungünstigen Bedingungen durch eine ewig denkwürdige Energie geschaffenes unpolitisches Kunstprodukt, an unpolitical artificial product. So, how is the Israel of the Pentateuch best described? As Politeia or as Theokratia? Or as both? German scholar Frank Grüsemann suggested to label the political theory of Deuteronomy as Theokratie als Demokratie. In that sense, there is no contradiction between the divine origin and the earthly realization of the community laws. And it seems to me that this is a key to a proper understanding of the Pentateuchal laws and of the organization of the Commonwealth of Israel. Divine authorization is not a distinct form of government, but the basic principle that underlies any form of government in Israel and in the ancient world as a whole. Theocracy appears in different forms of government: monarchy, democracy, hierarchy, and aristocracy or gerontocracy. Ultimately, all of these forms of government are divinely sanctioned. Next issue, realpolitik. Another unsettled issue is the question whether the political texts of the Hebrew Bible reflect realpolitik. Were, for example, the laws of the Pentateuch effective law at a certain time, or were they only drafts, or even mere ideas? In my opinion, Wellhausen was wrong when he labeled the Pentateuch as an unpolitical artificial product. On the other hand, one has to admit that the evidence for the implementation of these laws are scarce. I try to bypass this problem by referring to political thought. This means the texts considered below are believed to have a political intention. The programmatic texts were meant to have a political impact. The laws were meant to become effective, regardless the uncertainty if and when they ever achieved their goal. Second, political thought and selected literary compositions of the Hebrew Bible. The following tour d'horizon through the Hebrew Bible starts with the literary complex Genesis to 2 Kings, and within this complex, with the supposedly oldest part, the Saul-David narrative and the so-called succession history. Second, I will cover the major prophets with only a short sideways look on the minor prophets. Third, from the scriptures, only the Psalms will be addressed. Finally, I will make the attempt for to find a conclusive development of the political thought in the Hebrew Bible. The Deuteronomistic narratives and the Book of Samuel have the legitimacy of the Davidic dynasty as their theme. These compositions are not contemporary to the protagonists. Their concern is not the legitimacy of David as person, but the legitimacy of the Davidic dynasty. The controversial point is the relation between the house of Saul and the house of David, or between Judah and Benjamin. The story is narrated from a distant point of view. Saul and David are conceptualized as paradigmatic founder figures whose fortunes determine the relation of the later tribal region. In terms of state theory, the Saul-David narrative and the succession history are traditional works. Monarchy is the self-evident form of government. Samuel and his role as prophet is the mediator of God's will. 1 Samuel 8 is not part of the old story, of course. Monarchy is the self-evident form of government. Samuel, in his role as prophet, is the mediator of God's will. The Israelite monarchy is divinely ordained. But in terms of politics, these two literary compositions are anti-traditional because they advocate Judahite dominion over Benjamin, and in case of the succession history, also a Jerusalem-centered administration. The problem to be solved by means of political thought is the translatio imperii from the house of Saul to the house of David. The Davidites narrative. By this term, I mean the pre-Deuteronomistic composition in the books of Samuel and Kings. In other words, I consider the basic strand in the book of Kings as a prolongation of the Saul-David narrative and the succession history. Again, this is a work with a basically traditional attitude. Again, there's a strong Judahite stance of the authors, but the adversary has changed. It is no longer Benjamin, but Ephraim, or to say the northern kingdom or the former northern kingdom of Israel. The ideological construct becomes evident in the evaluation of the kings, which are all negative in case of the northern kings, and even more in the so-called dynastic oracles. The system of these oracles results in the condemnation of all northern dynasties, and on the contrary, in the enduring legitimacy of the southern monarchy, the House of David. This work has two cornerstones: the dynastic promise in 2 Samuel 7, 11 to 16, and the rehabilitation of King Jehoiachin in 2 Kings 25. The story was written to defend the rights of the Davidites after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and after their deportation to Babylon. It is an apology, an elaborated pamphlet against any claims from Ephraimite allies. The problem to be solved by means of political thought is, can a dynasty whose current head is deported, whose capital and whose national temple is destroyed, still have legitimacy? See Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic history. Deuteronomy may be called a constitution, or a draft constitution to be more careful. The so-called office laws, Professor Otto already talked about that, the so-called office laws regulate the appointment and the conduct of the office holders. The judges and the officers, Deuteronomy 16, 18 to 20, the central court, the optional king, the priests, the prophet, and the military leaders in Deuteronomy 20. Taking Deuteronomy 12 to 20 together, one may label that section laws on offices and institutions of the Commonwealth. Beginning with the communal sanctuary in 12 to 16, further including the social laws in 14 and 15, the asylum laws in chapter 19, and of course the warfare laws in chapter 20. The sanctuary laws and the social laws are intertwined because the sanctuary in Deuteronomy is the place of redistribution of goods among the members of community. We already heard about this close connection of politics and economy. The sanctuary in Deuteronomy is the place of redistribution of goods. These laws combine into a complete set of offices. Only the elders are missing. They are not missing in Deuteronomy. On the contrary, they are the spokesmen of the people, but there is no elders' law, most probably because elders do not attain their status by appointment, but by recognition. In terms of constitutional theory, Deuteronomy constitutes primarily a citizen state or a republic. Only in case the optional king is in office, it defines a constitutional monarchy in which the king is answerable to the law. If there is a king or not, does not make a big difference because all communal functions are already assigned. This very fact distances Deuteronomy from traditional ancient Near Eastern societies and puts it on the side of early Greek, or better, early Mediterranean polis. The central role that is traditional held by the king has been transferred to the law. And the law is not imposed on the people, no, on the contrary. God merely lets Moses set the laws before the people. Exodus 21, verse 1, Deuteronomy 4, verse 44, and Deuteronomy 11, verse 32. And the people adopt the laws by passing a resolution. Exodus 24, Deuteronomy 26, compare Nehemiah 10. Now, a few words on the Deuteronomistic history. In my opinion, what we call the Deuteronomistic history should be restricted to the so-called reflective texts. For example, Joshua 23 and a few others. These texts turn the older monarchic texts into an anti-monarchic thing. The first and most important text is 1 Samuel 8, of course. The alternative is not pro-monarchic versus anti-monarchic, as often stated. Rather, the older texts are pro-Davidic. The monarchy as such is not under dispute, and the Deuteronomistic ones are anti-monarchic, no matter which dynasty. The ideal is no longer David, but the law of Deuteronomy, not Moses, the law. There are Deuteronomistic statements which seem to contradict that statement. This includes Gideon's refusal to become king. I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. Yahweh shall rule over you. Judges 8, verse 23. And God's word to Samuel in 1 Samuel 8, they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. At first glance, one might say the Deuteronomists advocate a theocracy. But the theocracy of the Deuteronomy is clearly a mediated theocracy. And who or what is the mediator? Of course, not a king, at least not alone, and likewise not Moses alone. It is mediated by the law, the constitution in the first place, and dependent on that by the office holders. The problem to be solved by means of political thought is the loss of the king, the end of the Davidic monarchy in the Babylonian period. The solution is the republic, the Republican Commonwealth of the Assembly of Yahweh. The priestly composition of the Pentateuch. The priestly text of the Pentateuch, and I think in the book of Joshua as well, place the sanctuary and the Aaronite priests in the forefront. That has led some scholars to speak of Israel as a cultic community. But the community of the priestly texts is not exclusively cultic. The priestly laws cover a wide range of topics, not only cultic matters. For example, Leviticus 18, 19, and 20, but there are many more. Likewise, the priest's duties are not restricted to cultic matters. According to Leviticus 10, the priests are obliged to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, and between the unclean and the clean, and to stipulate all the statutes which Yahweh has spoken to them through Moses. The priestly sanctuary is the place where Moses receives divine sentence in unprecedented juridical cases, in Leviticus 24 and Numbers 15, for example. The priests consult the oracle in case of war, and Joshua is commanded to heed the voice of the priest, Numbers 27. The high priest is the anointed one, Numbers 35, as was the king before. And just as the death of the old king and the accession of the new king gave occasion for the release of prisoners and slaves, the death of the high priest initiated the release of asylums, Numbers 35. To be sure, all texts mentioned above are commonly considered to be late priestly texts, or even very late priestly texts. Those who believe in a priestly Grundschrift will come to a very different picture of the role of the priests. I leave that issue aside and concentrate myself on the priestly composition in its full extent. Viewed from that angle, the priestly texts of the Pentateuch are only the beginnings, what appears fully developed, for example, in the so-called Artaxerxes Edict in Ezra 7. I will come to that point later. And in Chronicles. Just as the high priest has adopted royal features, the sanctuary has taken over the role of the palace. Certainly, the sanctuary is the cultic center of the community, but it is also the treasury, the high court, and the seat of the government. Unlike in Deuteronomy, the people do not pass the laws in the priestly texts. Each law is orally transmitted from Yahweh to Moses, presumably in the Holy of Holies, and from Moses to the people. The consent of the people is not required. The problem to be solved by means of political thought is the increasing importance of the Jerusalem temple beginning at the end of the 5th century. The solution is the reconfiguration of the high priest as head of the Commonwealth. Point E, the post-priestly text of the Pentateuch. I shall limit myself to one text, the installation of the Senate in Numbers 11. This is one of those texts featuring the so-called outside tent, which is an anti-priestly concept. Moses is commanded to gather the elders and the officers, the shoterim, and take 70 from them in order to establish a senate. This is a further development of the office system of Deuteronomy. The important roles of the elders and the officers are presupposed in Numbers 11 and given a defined organizational structure. The Senate is endowed with the spirit of Moses. That means the Senate performs its duties according to the guideline of the Torah. In the Pentateuch, there are 3 episodes devoted to the relief of Moses. In Exodus 18, Moses inaugurates a 2-level judicial system in which men of reputation settle normal cases of dispute, whereas Moses himself brings the complicated cases before Yahweh. In Deuteronomy 1, again, Moses organizes the judiciary, and again, wise men of reputation take over responsibility, but this time by choice of the people. Numbers 11 goes beyond the 2 forerunners. It is not about the judiciary, but about the overall leadership role in the community. And therefore the requirement is not only wisdom and good reputation, but the spirit of Moses. The problem to be solved by means of political thought is the continual role of the lay elite besides the priests. The solution is the spirit of Moses, that is the Torah, that has to guide all the decisions and measures of the Senate. Point F, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. The literary compositions in Ezra and Nehemiah show roughly the same development as those in the Pentateuch. The presumably oldest texts are the Nehemiah memoir and the Aramaic temple building account in Ezra 5-6. Here, like in Deuteronomy, the lay elite takes the leadership role in the Commonwealth. In the Nehemiah memoir, besides the governor, the most important group are the nobles, the Chorim. In the temple building account, it is the elders. The priests do not play a major role. On contrary, in the Nehemiah memoir, the Levites are personae miserae, Nehemiah 13, as in Deuteronomy. Although in both narratives, the Persian king initiates the events, actually he's not involved in the activities. The Judean-born governor and the Judean elders and nobles act largely on their own. On the other hand, in the Artaxerxes Edict, Ezra 7, the temple, and I consider the Artaxerxes Edict to be a very late text, the temple is the center of the community and the priests exert their executive power. The Persian king gives detailed orders, all of which are in favor of the temple and the people associated with it. Ezra, he is the Aaronite priest in these texts, is granted the right to install judges, which is not identical but in line with the priestly composition of the Pentateuch, but opposed to the regulation in Deuteronomy, where the appointment of judges is the right of the popular assembly, Deuteronomy 16, verse 18. The Pentateuch and Ezra and Nehemiah are in a way complementary to each other. They show roughly the same development from a lay people-led citizen state to a temple-centered hierarchy. But whereas the Pentateuch defines the inner structure of the Israelite commonwealth and derives it from God, Ezra and Nehemiah pays a great deal of attention to the foreign relations and derives all developments in Persian period Judah from the Persian kings. The problem to be solved by means of political thought is the relation of Persian period Judah to the hegemonic power. Point G, the book of Jeremiah. The book of Jeremiah is full of political texts, most of them pertaining to the Babylonians. Jeremiah advocates the submission of Judah under Babylonian overlordship. But Jeremiah also considers domestic politics, beginning with his collaboration with Gedaliah, the Babylonian installed governor in post-war Judah. But the book of Jeremiah, much like Deuteronomy, even contains a set of laws regulating offices and institutions. These offices are defined in 4 episodes playing under the rule of King Jehoiakim, namely Jeremiah 26, 35, 36, and 45. The reign of Jehoiakim, and in particular the 4th year of his reign, signifies the beginning of the Babylonian dominion over Judah. These episodes are no historical reports, but rather proclamatic texts. What happens here has a paradigmatic function for the whole Babylonian period and even more for the later periods. It's post-monarchic, that's the point. Jeremiah 26 relates the trial against Jeremiah after his temple speech. The whole city is in turmoil. Almost everybody intervenes in one way or another, with one exception. The king plays no role in the affair. The office of the judge is first performed by the aristocrats, the Sarim, and then by the elders of the country. That's Jeremiah 26. In Jeremiah 35, Jeremiah and the Rechabites walk into the temple precinct in which the aristocrats again have a certain function, but not the priests who do not appear on the scene. Finally, Jeremiah installs the Rechabites, like the Levites, they are like the Levites, a group without land property, as priests. Much has been written, next chapter, it has to go very, very rapid now. Much has been written on Jeremiah 36. For the present purpose, it is suffice to advert to the fact that Jeremiah 36 inaugurates the public reading of the book of Jeremiah, whatever extent that may have had in the eyes of the author, and at a fasting ceremony. These two, the reading, the public reading, and the fasting. The crucial point is that the fasting day has no current occasion. It is not a reaction to a campaign or to a drought. Jeremiah already knows a year in advance of the Advent in verses 6 and 9. It seems as if a periodic reading is envisioned, just as the book of Deuteronomy is read publicly at a festival of booths, so the book of Jeremiah is read publicly at the annual fasting day. The problem to be solved by means of political thought is the same as in Deuteronomy, namely the end of the Davidic monarchy in the Babylonian period. Dependent on dating, the office laws of Jeremiah are a counterdraft to Deuteronomy or its predecessor. Next point, the book of Ezekiel. The following remarks will only cover the constitutional draft, Ezekiel 40 to 48. In terms of political thought, the relation of Ezekiel 40 to 48 to the priestly texts of the Pentateuch is similar to the relation of the Jehoiakim texts in Jeremiah to Deuteronomy. There are many similarities, but also some striking differences. As in P, the duties of the priest in Ezekiel reach beyond cultic matters. Much like Leviticus 10, the priests of Ezekiel, quote, shall take their stand to judge, they shall judge the people according to my God's ordinances. Chapter 44, verses 24. Different from P, the priests are not the Aaronites, but the Zadokites. And likewise, different from P, there's a civil ruler who is not called king, but prince, Nasi. Much like in Deuteronomy, there are regulations for the prince. He's not an autocrat, but answerable to the law, and primarily, but again, not exclusively in cultic matters. He is under the supervision of the priests. The problem to be solved by means of political thought is the same as in the priestly composition of the Pentateuch. Ezekiel 40 to 48 is an alternative proposition for a hierocratic Israel. Next point, the book of Isaiah. While the traditions of the book of Jeremiah developed a republican vision of Israel, and the Ezekiel traditions a hierocratic vision of Israel, the traditions of proto-Isaiah refrained from breaking new ground. They remained in the traditional monarchic paradigm. In terms of political thought, the promises of an ideal ruler are most significant. Isaiah 9, 1 to 6, 11, 1 to 9, and 32, 1 to 5, envision an ideal king bringing about justice and enduring peace. Likewise, Deutero-Isaiah, at least in his first part, holds to the monarchic paradigm. The Persian king Cyrus is the anointed of Yahweh, and bearing this title, he replaces the Davidic king. But there's another school of thought in Isaiah, in which there is no earthly king. Instead, Yahweh, the God of Israel, is king. Isaiah 33 exalts, for Yahweh is our judge, Yahweh is our lawgiver, Yahweh is our king, he will save us. This motive appears several times in Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and once in the so-called Apocalypse of Isaiah. In Proto-Isaiah, the development ran from the earthly king to the time ran from the earthly king at the time to the ideal savior king, whereas in Deutero-Isaiah, development ran from the ideal Persian king to the divine king. In terms of political thought, first there was adherence to the tradition, and then there was longing for a messianic or even eschatological variant of the tradition. Time is running out. I have few words to say on the Psalms, but I skipped that here because this is a very different thing. I come to my synthesis. Political thinking in the Hebrew Bible began in the monarchic era, and its subject was the legitimacy of the Davidic dynasty and the welfare of the king. Considering the royal text from the ancient Near East, this is no surprise. In comparison, the literary compositions of the Pentateuch and the Exarchate are conceptions of Israel without a king. In my opinion, the vast majority of these texts was written when there was no longer a king in Israel or in Judah respectively, and when there was a need to reconstitute Israel or Judah. The beginnings of these writings may be dated to the last decades of the Judahite monarchy, then as opposition literature. But the elaborated compositions stem from the Babylonian and from the Persian periods, then as constitutions for post-monarchic Judea. Therein we find two main conceptions. First, Israel as a citizen state with lay people as their leaders, and second, Israel as a temple-centered community with priests as its heads. Both conceptions were developed over several decades, both inside the Pentateuch and outside, as, for example, in Ezra and Nehemiah. They were mostly in conflict with each other, but sometimes also complementary. The Pentateuch, as a Deuteronomistic priestly compromise document, proves to the latter. On the long run, the hierocratic conceptions prevailed. The Pentateuch as a whole is priestly heavy, just as Ezra and Nehemiah as a whole is temple and priest centered. Even the temple vision of Ezekiel has left its traces in the building history of the Second Temple. The other conceptions were not completely discarded. They were not erased from the scrolls. The democratic concept of Deuteronomy was transferred into the model of a Senate. The monarchic texts of Samuel and Kings were reinterpreted in the promises of a just king in the latter prophets, and in a very different manner in Chronicles. I stop here. Thank you for your attention.